Hey, welcome to Q&A, where you ask your questions on faith and life, and I do my best to give a biblical perspective. Hey, let's jump right into today's question. What are the main characteristics of biblical manhood? I think it's a great question, especially in the light of today's emphasis on gender, and we tend to talk about gender in terms of sexual identity and all that stuff. And as a consequence, particularly for Christians, I think we don't talk about biblical manhood and all those things in the way that, well, certainly as a younger person, when I became a Christian, we used to. So perhaps in some ways it's a very timely question. But before I give my thoughts and respond to the question, let me just say that a couple of things. The first is that I think whenever we talk about gender identity, about those sorts of things, that we need to bear in mind what the Bible says in 1 Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 to 27, that makes it very clear that both male and female are created in the image of God. And so we can't preference one over the other. We both, male and female, men and women, have equal value in the standing of God. We may have different biblical roles and all those sorts of things. We may have different functions in the world, but we have equal standing before God, and therefore we should have equal standing before one another. We shouldn't preference one over the other. And I say that simply because I think any definition of biblical manhood should or must take that into consideration. I also want to say that when we talk about biblical manhood, I think that the biblical manhood isn't really defined as such in the Bible the way we may want it defined. I think really it's about manhood is being shown by the way you live. There's an old saying that being male is a matter of birth, being a man is a matter of choice. I think to be a man in the biblical context is to determine to live in certain ways. It's to show it by your faith and the actions that flow from that. I think, for example, of King David when he died and he was handing over his mantle, his legacy, if you will, to his son Solomon. And in 1 Kings chapter 2, in the opening verses, he says, take courage and be a man. Some verses, some Bible translations say, translate it, take courage and act like a man. Others have it, show yourself a man. The point being that to be a man after God's own heart, biblical manhood is about how we live. It's defined by the way we live in right relationship to God and those around us. So with that in mind, let me offer you some thoughts. I mean, where do you start? I think fundamentally, if we're going to talk about what are the biblical characteristics of biblical manhood, I'd want to say that the number one is it's a man who seeks God over himself. I think of Micah 6 verse 8, which talks about doing what is right and loving mercy and walking humbly with God. In other words, choosing God's ways over our own. And I think that's the foundation of biblical manhood, because so often the definitions and the examples that we see portrayed in society today are putting self at the center. It's about my needs, about my wants. It's about being successful on my terms or in the eyes of the world. It's all being defined by worldly standards. And Micah 6:8 says biblical manhood is defined by placing God first, following after him, not self. Which leads to, I guess, in some ways, I think another characteristic of biblical manhood is self-control, which flows out of seeking God first. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, let me bring it up here and make sure I get it right. It says, God's will is for you to be holy, so stay away from all sexual sin. Then each of you will control his own body. And the writer here is talking to men. It's about marriage and relationships. Each of you will control his own body and live in holiness and honor, not in lustful passion. So whatever biblical manhood looks like, it's going to involve self-control, not being driven by lust, by passions, not using people for their own glorification, for their own needs to make themselves feel good about themselves or anything like that. It's living a life that is holy because God is holy. We're made in his image. It's recognizing that where the boundaries around the expressions of our sexuality are within the confines of marriage. It's all of those sorts of things. It's controlling lustful desires, the appetites of the flesh. Some versions of the Bible say. I think another characteristic, I guess for me, given that if we go back to Genesis, that I mentioned before, we see that the norm for manhood is to find its ultimate expression or fulfillment in relationship with a wife and a family. I know that's not always, and you can follow examples of biblical manhood without being married. I totally get that. So if you're single, I'm not ruling you out and saying you can't be a biblical man or have biblical manhood. I'm saying that you will still experience this determination, these desires. You'd still want to fulfill these sorts of things if you get the opportunity, and that is to honor your wife and your family. In Colossians 3, we read that husbands love your wives and never treat them harshly. I think it's about verse 18, verse 19. So it's talking about honoring our wife. It's not, our relationship with our spouse is never hierarchical. Biblical manhood recognizes we're created equal in the eyes of God. We have different functions, but we're both image bearers. So we honor our wife and family. We're going to be talking about this in our series on 1 Peter in a few weeks, but in 1 Peter 3 verse 7, Peter writes, let me bring it up here. Just mine's not quite, here we go. In the same way, husbands must honor their wives. Treat your wife with understanding as you live together. She may be weaker than you are, but she's your equal partner in God's gift of new life. So treat her as you should, so your prayers will not be hindered. See, it recognizes that we're equal, but when Peter says they're weaker, it's not a put down. It's not a saying women are emotionally more vulnerable. They're not as strong. They're not your equal. What he's saying, treasure them, honor them as something precious, as something that is to be nurtured, something that has to be protected, as you would something that's valuable. So it's about honor. It's about valuing. It's about doing all that you can to esteem your wife and flowing on from that, your family, serving them, protecting them. By the way, it's about showing your love and concern by the way you care for them. Ephesians 5:25, Paul talks about husbands love your wives as Christ loves the church and lay down his life for them. So biblical manhood is about showing honor and respect and providing for those entrusted into your care. So to answer your question, what are some of the characteristics? I would say that biblical manhood is, we could go on, but it's built on a right relationship with God, that it's built on humility, on seeking to do the right thing by God, not simply the easiest thing or the thing that's right by yourself. It's about being self-controlled so that you are able to live as God would have you live, preferring the needs of others over your own, not yielding yourself to the passions of the flesh, to the desires of the heart in that context. It's about showing honor and love for your family, for your wife and family, caring and protecting them, and leading them into the fullness of life that God has for them. I think these are all characteristics of what biblical manhood looks like. I'm sure there are others. Love to hear your comments below. We could go on, but I think these are important characteristics that define what biblical manhood looks like, about what it means to live in right relationship with God, to live as a man being defined by the choices you make, not by the gender that you were born into. So yeah, I hope you give some thought, some cause for reflection, points you in the right direction. But that's it for now. As always, you can ask your questions on slido.com. Use the hashtag ALC23. Would love to hear from you. But until next time, God bless.